Hi, everyone. We talked about how the war started and how the warfare was so much different than it had been before. Today, we're going to finish up the war, talk about how the United States got into the war and what a big difference that made in the outcome of World War One, plus making the United States a world superpower at the end of this war. So the U.S. didn't want to be in the war. President Woodrow Wilson, he actually ran on the campaign platform that he kept us out of a war, and we tried to stay neutral. And as things went on, and there were a lot of things going on, there were Irish immigrants who did not want to be on the side of Great Britain in this war. There were a ton of German immigrants in the United States who did not want to fight against Germany. Our natural inclination was to fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary, but there was a lot of anti-British sentiment, like I said, as a result of Irish, the large Irish population here, and the large German population did not want us to go against the Germans either. But a lot of things happen that are going to bring the United States into the war on the side of Great Britain, Russia, and France. And one of those is the sinking of the Lusitania, which we'll get into a little bit more. It was a cruise liner that had Americans on board that got sunk by a U-boat, German U-boat. The Zimmerman note as well. Talk about that. That was a cable that was intercepted from Mexico to Germany, or from Germany to Mexico, trying to get Mexico to actually get involved in the war and attack the United States. And then finally, the Germans thought they had the upper hand, and they decided to have unrestricted submarine warfare, which they were going to sink any ship that came into their area. And that's going to be the final straw that makes the United States get involved. We're going to talk about each one of these in a little bit of detail coming up. First is Lusitania, and you can research this. There's plenty of videos out there. It was a ship that was similar to the Titanic. It was a luxury cruise liner. There had been so many mistakes made on this. There was a ad taken out in the paper in New York that anybody on the Lusitania would be at risk. There's many rumors that the Lusitania had been taking munitions caps and weapons of war in the hull so they were using this passenger ship to run weaponry between the countries. But the bottom line is that it was considered to be a cruise liner, considered to be a neutral ship, but it was sunk by a U-boat, a German U-boat. And in this case, 128 Americans were killed, plus many British people, many Irish people. The survivors going to wash up on the shores of Ireland and walk around for days, and was seen as a huge tragedy and something that really put the American people against the Germans, because many important and wealthy American families had people on this boat, and it's something worth researching. It really is. It's an interesting story of the Lusitania. The second thing that got the Americans sort of involved in the war, and this probably was the biggest for public opinion. The public opinion really wanted to keep the Americans neutral, but this letter that was that the British intercepted, ironically, that was from the Germans to the Mexicans. The British really wanted the Americans, to get involved in the war. So there is some belief that this may have been contrived, that maybe it wasn't a legitimate note, but the more you research, it really seems to be legitimate. But basically, the German Secretary of State, Zimmerman, wrote a note to Mexico asking them to attack the United States to kind of distract them so they wouldn't get involved in the war in Europe. They promised to get Japan involved as well. And interesting, at the time, the Americans and Japanese already had a little bit of a strained relationship. So World War II, that you'll learn about next year, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, there already was a strained relationship and a lot of suspicion between the Americans and Japanese at that point. But at any rate, this note that the British intercepted and gave to the Americans and then was published really turned the American people against the Germans and got a lot of them to want to get involved in the war. And you can see the part of this where, as you read it, that the Americans or that the Germans were going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which is the third aspect of this. And the Americans knew that there would be many more ships sunk if the Germans continued unrestricted submarine warfare and were going to sink any neutral ships or any ships that were out there. So finally, on April 6, 1917, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States of America, who had run on the platform of staying out of the war, decided that we need to get involved. He called it a war to end all wars, which you know that's not true because it ended up being World War I, and you wouldn't call it World War I unless there was a World War II. So as the good intentions he had to try and make this the last war, obviously we know that didn't happen. But anyway, he asked Congress for war. He also wanted to make the world safe for democracy. This was also the first example of us fighting a war for democracy. So the United States soldiers went into training, and by June, they were in Paris. And they're going to change the whole scene of the war. Trench warfare was brutal, and the soldiers were beaten down, and they had been going through this for 3 years, just charging other trenches and getting mowed down, and it was awful. So having the U.S. soldiers come in, these young men who were very brave and fought valiantly, it's going to change the tide of the war. Everybody else was sick of the war. They come in, and they have this new renewed energy and are going to change the war into the Allies' favor. And the Allies are going to defeat the Central Powers. And on November 11th, 1918, Germany is going to finally agree to end the war. So it was on 11/11, even at 11 a.m., they signed it. And so the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, the war is going to come to an end. The peace treaty, however, was something that many people are going to blame on causing World War II. You had these people involved. George Clemenceau, who was the Prime Minister of France. The French really wanted revenge on Germany. A lot of the fighting took place in France. Many French citizens were killed. There was a lot of land that was in dispute between France and Germany, and they wanted to really get some revenge on Germany and have the harshest terms there were. There was also David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the people of Great Britain wanted to punish Germany because of bombing raids that were done there and the overall treatment of the British and how many British soldiers were lost. But David Lloyd George wanted to not have such harsh treatment of of Germany, that it would cause another war. Vittorio Orlando from Italy was also there, and he was there. He had been promised the Adriatic coast, which was northern Italy, would have been southern Austria-Hungary at the time. For switching sides, he was promised that, he said, but he wasn't given much say in the actual negotiations, which will lead to Italy being part of the Axis powers in World War II with Mussolini. Woodrow Wilson, who was the President of the United States, came up with a huge plan. It was called the 14 Points, and he wanted peace with honor. He wanted to not disrespect Germany. He wanted to just prevent future wars, was his plan. And these are a lot of parts of his plan. He wanted to ban secret treaties because that war blew up so quickly because people didn't know what they were actually getting into when they declared war, who all the alliances were. Guarantee freedom of the seas to avoid the U-boats attacks and the uncertainty of trade and all of those things going on in the seas, that you had to keep any wartime activity within, I think it was 3 miles of their coast. Wanted to reduce armaments and weapons, So to make sure that they didn't have these huge standing armies that we talked about before at all times, they also wanted to create the League of Nations. This was something that Woodrow Wilson was very passionate about, to protect the independence of all nations. However, he could not convince the Congress of the United States of America to go along with this because they didn't want to get involved in all these wars in Europe. So they wanted to be more isolationist. And Woodrow Wilson spent most of his days, the last days of his life, really trying to convince Congress to accept and the people to accept the 14 points. And we didn't ratify this treaty when it ended up happening. And that was a big deal because it didn't have a whole lot of teeth because the biggest superpower in the world did not approve of the treaty or did not ratify the treaty. These are the terms of peace, the Treaty of Versailles. Germany admitted full responsibility for the war, even though they weren't the first ones to declare war. Austria-Hungary had declared war first, but because Germany said that they would support them if they went to war, they were blamed for the entirety of the war. They had to give up all their colonies in Africa and any colonies they had around the world. They also gave up some land in their country, within their country. Poland was carved out of part of Germany and Russia. Alsace-Lorraine was given back to France, and there were some areas that ended up being part of Czechoslovakia, which wasn't a country before the war, but became one with this treaty. They were limited on the size of their military, and they had to pay reparations of $33 billion, which is a lot of money today. It was a whole lot of money then. It's going to bankrupt Germany. Part of this was the League of Nations would be created. Again, the United States would not be a part of that. They redrew the map, which had many new countries on it. The United States didn't ratify the treaty again because they didn't agree to become part of the League of Nations. Today, the League of Nations is similar to the United Nations, which we are a part of, but that was after World War II, before we were involved. Some of the results overall, this was the deadliest war up to this time. And Russia, who was big into the war, pulled out in 1917 and ended up having a revolution of their own. They became a communist country under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. In Europe, there were 8 million soldiers who died, and the economy was devastated. There were 10 million more people who starved to death as a result of the devastation by the war. So 18 million people in Europe died as a result. They broke up a lot of the empires. The Ottoman Empire, which is today where Turkey is, and Hungary, and some of the countries in Southern Europe and also Northern Africa and the Middle East. Austria-Hungary became different countries, Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Those are countries that all came out of there. Yugoslavia has since broken up. Germany and Russia both lost that area that was Poland. And then there's some other new nations that showed up in Europe. Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Yugoslavia, which is now 5 different nations, which are Macedonia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that even the groups in Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and also the Middle East, they didn't really consider the people who lived in these places. They just kind of drew up the map, which ended up being a problem because it led to some future conflicts, where even up into the early 2000s, they'd put people together that didn't want to be together, and those countries are still splitting up and finding their own nationalistic viewpoints, such as, like I said, Czech Republic and Slovakia and Yugoslavia splitting, and all those other countries. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were countries that ended up within the Soviet Union, and then from the 50s to the 90s, and now we're back to their independent countries again. You can see some of the death tolls of this, and one of the people that was really upset with the outcome, Russia, because they had the revolution and left the war early, got nothing in the peace settlement. they actually probably lost more territory than anybody else. They lost Finland, they lost Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they lost the area that was Poland. And even though they lost the most soldiers and had the most involved, they got nothing out of the settlement because of the revolution that happened there. They weren't invited. They were not invited to be involved in the peace settlement. So that's going to lead to a lot of problems down the road and a lot of the Cold War that went all the way up into the 90s. This is what the map looked like after World War One. Something we didn't get a chance to talk about is how Ireland had a rebellion during this war. The Irish people did not want to fight for Great Britain, and they actually took a chance in 1916 to have their own rebellion there. That's going to lead to an Irish Free State, and Southern Ireland being free in 1920. The United States also was hugely impacted, and you'll learn a lot about this next year in your 20th Century American course. We lost 116,000. I don't want to say only, but compared to the other countries, as you saw on that chart, it was not a huge number of dead compared to most of the countries involved in this war. We're able to. None of the war was fought on our soil, so even though we lost soldiers, but we were on the winning side, and we become the richest and most powerful country in the world. We're going to have a lot of markets to make this help to rebuild Europe. The people who work in the factories are going to have higher wages because everybody was employed during this wartime economy. However, there are going to be some bad things too. Distrust of foreigners, especially Germans, Italians, Austrians. Again, there's going to be a lot of people who want to keep the United States to their own. They're going to be a little bit of hostility versus immigrants that are coming in. They want to be isolated. There's also some racial issues that have developed while the soldiers went to fight in the war. There was a very few number of African American regiments. One of those, if you read about it last week, the Harlem Hellfighters were one, but mostly the African Americans and recently freed slaves really were put to work in the factories. And as these soldiers went over, and then when the white soldiers came back from the war, the African Americans that were working were put out of their jobs. So it caused a lot of tension, and there was a lot of racial issues in the 19 teens and the early 1920s. In a lot of cities throughout the country, there were a lot of racial issues.